video is about the housing assistance types and the basics, the housing assistance types within the state of North Dakota. There are 4 different types of housing assistance: Section 8 housing vouchers, public housing complexes, subsidized housing complexes, and low-income tax credit properties. The housing assistance programs may differ by project, county, and owner. It is best to check with that housing assistance availability, whether there's a county housing authority or a particular building, to check what their requirements are and their information. Housing programs do not share application information. Because the assistance might be tied to a particular program or to a particular building or to a particular developer, that information is not carried over. Consequently, if you apply for a subsidized housing complex, your application is not part of a Section 8 housing complex or a Section 8 housing voucher. It is best to make sure and check with those organizations that your application is valid and to apply at each one. Quickly look at the Section 8 housing voucher. The Section 8 housing voucher is HUD federally funded. The voucher does have waiting lists. That means that clients need to apply and look at what they are applying for and the particular type of preferences available within those areas. Do check and ask the housing authority what preferences are available, what documentation you might need. Housing authorities cannot deviate from those waiting list preferences, and so it is best to understand them. The Section 8 vouchers are sought after within the country because there is limited funding. HUD and the federal government, or Congress, Congress makes the budget for HUD and limits the amount of voucher dollars available. That means that in areas such as Minneapolis, vouchers might have been closed for many years, and so voucher applicants might be looking in other areas of the country. In some areas, waiting lists could be 3 years because of limited funding and the number of vouchers. A housing authority may have more vouchers than dollars available. The voucher program allows clients to find suitable housing working with private landlords. As long as the unit passes inspection and was in the cost standard, typically the housing authority is able to assist. But the voucher also is tied to that person and not to a particular building. So it allows the clients to move not just within the jurisdiction, but actually anywhere in the country, and the assistance is supposed to stay with them. There may be local requirements within that portability process, which allows clients to move to other states. So it is best to check with that housing authority. As mentioned, there is a budget, and it does not change based on need or rents. If an area or a developer wants to see more vouchers in a particular part of the country or a county within the state of North Dakota, that does not mean that there will be additional budget dollars. The budget is controlled by Congress, and other places like Los Angeles and San Diego or Atlanta, Georgia have had their waiting lists closed for a really long time, which means that just because North Dakota wants additional vouchers doesn't mean that we would get them. Other areas of the country are in much more dire need. There are also rent limits, and HUD limits these based on surveys, American Community Survey data, and other pieces of information. The local housing authority can look at that and justify whether or not the rent limit should be a plus or minus 10% from that rent limit set by HUD. That rent limit is not supposed to be covering upscale, but is supposed to cover moderate income or close to some, or just below the moderate income or market rate income. Those limits, called a payment standard, must include utilities. So if the payment standard for a 2-bedroom is $700, that needs to be the rent plus utilities included. So whatever utilities the client will be responsible for must fall underneath that. Now, a client may have income that allows them to go above that, but HUD does not want them to go above 40% of their income. This gets a little bit tricky, but it is best to check with the housing authority to see what their policies are. The income limits may be higher than the rent limits. In some areas, the income limits continue to increase, whereas the rent limits provided by these surveys may fall, which means that people might be income eligible, but actually the 30% of their income is too high for those rents. And so the person ends up paying full rent anyway compared to what the calculations are. Some things to know. The need outpaces the funds. Local waiting lists can be months to years. In some cases, it can be up to 4 years within even the state of North Dakota. There are some housing authorities that still in the state of North Dakota have their waiting list closed or open them just for a little bit and close them because of the amount of applications that they receive outpacing the funds. Minneapolis, St. Paul, and the metro HRAs within that, the Minneapolis-St. Paul areas or the Twin City areas, recently opened their applications process but closed them shortly after. Receiving tens of thousands of applications, it will take years to go through those. The city of Rochester, Minnesota recently opened their applications and will expect to see thousands of applications and try to use a lottery to bring those down to what is manageable and usable within a couple of years. Some large agencies have had their waiting list closed for more than 10 years. This happens in places like San Diego and Atlanta, Georgia. So people are looking for assistance elsewhere and willing to move there because the assistance for rent is limited by the congressional budget. There are areas in rural parts of the country where USDA and HUD-funded subsidized complexes have openings and have a tough time leasing up. Sometimes because the demand has slowed down, but other times that the funding has slowed and the rents had increased. So there are openings within that. But again, they are rural areas and sometimes hard to access for services for others. The other change that happened within the last 15 years is the changes to college students. And it limits college students' availability to housing assistance only if there is a family involved or there is over an age range that the college student is no longer a dependent of that family. Type of housing assistance is public housing. Again, this is a federally funded program that the local housing authority becomes a contractor through HUD. There are waiting lists within public housing. The building is owned and controlled by the housing authority and not that assistance is not transferable anywhere else. It is contained to that building. The assistance is controlled. The rent is controlled by HUD. And those complexes are not allowed to use traditional financing. So they're not allowed to go to, let's say, a bank to get rehab loans or anything else. They are restricted within their funding. So there are only a few housing authorities within the state of North Dakota that have public housing versus Section 8 housing. And in fact, some of the housing authorities are getting out of public housing that transfers them to Section 8 assistance. This is called repositioning, and it is something in which HUD and the federal and Congress are actually pushing housing authorities to do. And there is subsidized housing. Subsidized housing is very similar to public housing, in that the assistance is tied directly to the building and controlled by many of the aspects. However, the building is not owned by a government entity. It is typically owned or ran by a company or nonprofit. Again, different applications, different things that they may control or look at for allowing a client. Type of housing is a tax credit. Tax credits are properties that have used investors to help lower rents for a specific time. These investors put a specific amount of dollars into a project to help buy down the long-term debt to lower the rents, and in turn, those investors get tax breaks. Those tenants must be low or moderate income, and those rents must be controlled for a specific time. Some rents and some complexes may be allowed to have specific criteria. So an elderly or disabled complex that is only allowed by HUD under specific rules. The building must follow requirements set forth by the federal and state governments, meeting code, accounting, accessibility, and locations. Some things to know. Again, waiting list. The waiting list does have preferences. Check that housing authority or that project to see if there are specific preferences that apply to your case. Stories and calls do not change the waiting list. A person may call and try to say that they're homeless or try to explain that their situations are much more dire than anybody else on the application waiting list. However, the waiting list, the housing authority or the entity must follow that waiting list and how people have applied. Things that often delay a person's application or may cause them not to receive housing assistance. That the application is possibly incomplete and missing documents. The group or the housing authority must require or must inform that the application is incomplete and what information might be required. If the applicant does not return those required documents in a timely fashion, the application is then deemed ineligible and unusable, and so the person will have to reapply unless the documents appeared within that time period. That is why it is important, and it should be on every application, to make sure that the application is complete. Read through the application and understand what you are applying for, and look at it to make sure that everything is signed and everything that you are required to bring in, you bring in. Social Security cards are required of every household member. This is something so that the housing authority can match the information on that Social Security card with HUD's systems that connect with Social Security. If your name has changed but hasn't legally changed, the housing authority or that housing provider must use the legal name on the Social Security card and must be able to verify the Social Security numbers on those cards. Adults must provide a photo ID. This allows the housing authorities to verify that they are indeed visiting with the person that is there. And housing authorities may require state-certified birth certificates or passports. Again, this is another tool to look at the verification of documents and the verification of any statuses. Housing authorities and housing providers do not pay back rent. If a person owes their landlord thousands of dollars for back rent, the housing authority does not pay that back. If a person receives a housing choice voucher, the voucher only starts on that particular date once an inspection is passed or the person is able to move in. It does not help with anything that is owed. That is between the landlord and the tenant. And landlords do have the right not to allow a person to continue if there are dollars owed. Housing authorities do not stop evictions. If there is an eviction in process, that is something, again, that is a tenant-landlord issue, and the tenant should look for legal counsel if needed. the follow through. The housing authorities or housing provider cannot provide any legal advice. The housing provider and housing authority can provide contacts for like legal services, High Plains Fair Housing, and the Department of Labor. Those organizations are able to provide advice specific to their organizational mission. Housing authorities typically do not have emergency assistance. This comes up often when working with folks that might be facing eviction or other legal aspects that require a person to help provide immediate assistance. That is not typically what housing authorities do, and does not allow, housing authorities are not allowed to bypass the waiting list because of an eviction or any other process. So if a judge issues an eviction, and even if the judge calls the housing authority cannot bypass a waiting list in order to put a person on. It is best to work with those processes long before that situation comes up. However, there are some emergency assistance programs, but again, their funding can be very limited. And there might be some additional requirements on those emergency programs that do not apply. It is best to try to work with housing assistance providers to get housing assistance long before a situation arises. Each housing authority, if you're dealing with Section 8 or public housing, may have different policies called an admin plan. And an admin plan is a public document. Now, there are some policies in place for public housing as well. All of those policies are public documents and a person can request them. They may differ from each housing authority or from each county or from each different project. Each subsidized or tax credit project may have different policies and screening policies. Best to call and ask. Do not assume that assistance transfers from one area to another. If you're going from a subsidized complex, you need to apply to receive a housing voucher. It does not transfer over. It is best to call and ask questions ahead of time before giving any notices. Housing authorities throughout the state of North Dakota may run other housing authorities, and this map shows the different areas that are ran by other groups. And as you can see, there are large clumps of where different groups run. So where different housing authorities may cover different parts of the state. This is very important to understand that your housing authority locally might be ran in another area, and best to call that area to get better information. Once approved, clients still need to, for the Section 8 programs, clients still need to meet with the landlords, pay deposit, and the unit must still pass inspection. All paperwork must complete. Employment, asset, and other verifications are required before any assistance is paid. Questions regarding the income calculation and how housing providers calculate the income needed for rent. Housing uses gross income. So it's the income prior to taxes and deductions on your payroll stub. It is your wage, the amount per hour, times the number of hours you are working. Housing providers are able to deduct child care costs if the household is working or attending education. Providers can also deduct medical costs for elderly and or disabled households. But those medical costs must be ongoing, regular costs that are being paid out of pocket by the household. Any income that the household receives must count. Any regular income received, contributions from other family members, organizations, any other payments that are received must be counted. Not just the income, but Social Security, child support, spousal support must be counted as income. Housing providers cannot deduct insurance, car payments, student loans, credit card payments, personal loans, or child support payments made. These are rules set forth by Congress. For a general rule, look at 30% of the household's annual gross income as being the affordable rent. Example, if the household member makes $12 per hour at 40 hours per week, there are 52 weeks in a year. This is important to remember as some people may get paid every 2 weeks. There are 26 pay periods if it's every 2 weeks. At $12 per hour and 40 hours per week, that is 2,080 hours of work a year, or roughly $24,960. The $24,960 multiplied by 30%, or 0.3, equals $7,488. You divide that by the 12 months, and it equals $624 a month. That would be the amount that is affordable for that household for rent, and would be the amount that that household would pay towards rent. Here are some contacts throughout the state of North Dakota. So you look at some housing authorities through HUD, Money Follows the Persons, HUD subsidized properties, USDA subsidized properties, and North Dakota Housing and Finance. Information about how the different types of housing assistance works, including how income limits are looked at and the percentages. Please check out the information at YouTube or at GreatPlainsHA.com. Presentation are done by Great Plains Housing Authority.